This grace is also what was called for by Ruth Bader Ginsburg on her deathbed. She didn't know who would win this election, but she thought it was best to call to the better angels of our nature, that sometimes the greatest demonstration of power is when we do not use it. That this precious democracy, this great experiment that has endured for this period of time has sustained itself on acts of decency and grace. And most importantly, on trust, trusting people, trusting Americans, trusting voters. Now, we haven't always gotten it right, but this fundamental ideal that when people are exercising their voice, the people in this body should listen. Over 50 million Americans. We are days, in fact, hours away from the actual election day, but the process has started already. People are speaking, but we are refusing to listen. And I fear that what's driving many people to the polls are some of the very issues that this Supreme Court justice will be in a position to hear. We know that Donald Trump spent the last 4 years trying to overturn the Affordable Care Act. He made a promise to only appoint justices who would overturn it. He promised that he would nominate a judge who would, and I quote, do the right thing, unlike Bush appointee John Roberts on Obamacare. This is clear. We know that the majority leader, Mitch McConnell, controlling this floor, has spent years trying to overturn the Affordable Care Act. In fact, between the House and the Senate, there have been over 70 votes to overturn the Affordable Care Act. And we know that there is a case that will come before the Supreme Court on November 10th that could very well determine whether or not over 600,000 people in my state and 20 million people across the country can keep their health coverage. So this is not a secret. The American people know what's going on. They see what's happening here, and many of them, I believe, are going to the polls to speak about the issue of health care. And instead of waiting and trusting to hear and listen to the will of the people, we are here right now. Folk are scared. We are, in a sense, walking through the valley of the shadow of death, the fourth largest mass casualty event in the history of our country, and the death rate is rising every single day. That's why so many Americans have been speaking out and calling out, because they know what this nomination could very well mean for their lives and for that of their family members. They know what a world without the ACA would be like, and for a president to nominate someone, a president hostile to the ACA, a Supreme Court justice who has spoken to this, they know what this might mean. We know that for 3.8 million New Jerseyans and 130 million Americans who have pre-existing conditions, people with diabetes, cancer survivors, people with diseases like my dad had, Parkinson's, it could mean being charged more or denied coverage completely. This is a terrifying reality. Folk who are going to the polls, waiting in hours online, know what it could mean that once again more people are being bankrupted by outrageous medical bills. They know what it could mean for lifetime caps on care for children with complex medical conditions. They know what it would mean for a family with a child who survived a medical procedure and another medical procedure and another medical procedure, surgery after surgery, being told, if you want your child to live, pay for it yourself. So many Americans know what it would mean for seniors not being able to afford life-saving prescriptions, making the dangerous decision to cut pills in half or ration their insulin. So many Americans know that losing the ACA could mean real tragedy. New Jersey, over 600,000 people losing their health care in the middle of a pandemic that in my state has already killed 16,000 of our first responders, of our neighbors, in many cases our friends and our family members. And these are numbers, these are data, these are statistics, but each one is a human life. Each one has dignity. Each one has family. I know, for example, Michelle Lewis from Palisades Park, New Jersey. When Michelle lost her husband, John, suddenly last year, she also lost the health coverage she had through his job. But she was able to get coverage through the Affordable Care Act's marketplace and qualify for a subsidy that made it more affordable for her. Today, she's insured and she can manage her diabetes and her heart disease and her autoimmune disease because of her coverage. She said that if she lost her affordable health care, she would have to sell her home and be in financial crisis. Losing the ACA for Merritt Bowman, who's a 49-year-old dad with twin boys and a football coach from New Jersey, he said that before the ACA was passed, he didn't even go to the doctor because he was afraid he couldn't afford it, putting his own health in danger. After the ACA, he was able to get affordable coverage. And when he felt sick a few years back, he made a doctor's appointment and was diagnosed with diabetes. Today, thank God, his condition has improved. But he said, and I quote, "Now I have a pre-existing condition. My insurance covers my medications, my equipment to monitor my diabetes. If that's taken away from me, what's going to happen? I can't afford those things on my own." I know this reality. We must know this reality. We must listen to Americans right now who are saying openly, "I'm going to the polls because of my fears on health care." And yet we are going through, instead of waiting to listen to our fellow Americans, showing that grace that they should decide, we are rushing forward. What about protections that are granted people, like those under Roe v. Wade? What about that? Decisions that we should let voters decide. We should listen to the American people. What about protections for workers? What about protections for organizers? What about voting rights? All of these issues in the midst of an election deserve to be decided by the people. The American people know what's at stake right now because we know that Donald Trump nominated Judge Barrett with a very specific agenda in mind. He told us very clearly. We know that Donald Trump wants the Affordable Care Act to be overturned, and he would appoint judges that he believed would do that. We know Donald Trump wants Roe v. Wade overturned. He has explicitly told us that. We know that Donald Trump wants us to question the validity of an election because he has questioned the validity of an election that is ongoing right now. I never imagined I would have a day in my life as an American citizen. I watch other countries, but I never thought in my own we would have a leader that would question the validity of an election, going as far as to say that if I lose, this election was rigged, it was illegitimate. That does real damage to not just this moment in time, it does damage to our very institutions, our processes that are essential for this democracy. It is dangerous language. The behavior of this president is so dangerous that his own cabinet members, former cabinet members, have called it out. I know the strength of our nation, but our institutions must be protected. They must be preserved. The processes that ensure this democracy continues to go on, that our truth goes marching on, have to be protected. And when you have a president that calls into question our very election processes and literally says that if I lose, it's illegitimate, and then says, I won't even commit to a peaceful transfer of power, that should raise alarms. And that's why people within his own party, people that served in his own cabinet, people respected in this entire body, like General Mattis, former Secretary of Defense, have said that Donald Trump is a threat to our democracy. And it is in that context, in the middle of a national crisis, that we're in the midst of an election, and we can't even get a Supreme Court nominee to commit themselves to the idea of the peaceful transfer of power, who the president himself has said he is rushing to the highest court in the land because he believes that this election may be decided by that judge. And that judge won't even commit to recusing themselves under these circumstances. Is that strengthening our democracy? Is that girding trust in our country's processes? Or is it weakening them? Because it clearly is doing damage to what is necessary for the endurance of our country and our ideals. These aren't just my words. These are the words of people on both sides of America's political divide. And yet we are not showing restraint in this moment. We are not showing that grace. We are rushing for short-term gain for one political party at the long-term damage to our nation. I don't understand why this is not something that arises worry and concern. A president who so easily trashes some of the most valued and sacrosanct ideals. I remember the hurt I felt when peaceful protesters in Lafayette Park were turned upon. I remember a note I was forwarded from a college classmate, if I have it correct, about her son being hit with a rubber bullet. I remember journalists that I've learned and got to know in these very hallways telling me about the horror of seeing the panic and the screams and the running as the gas and the rubber bullets hit. I saw how our president seemed to utilize the military themselves to menace what is one of our most important constitutional protections, the right to protest peacefully. I have seen 4 years now as too many people have remained silent in the face of erosions to our constitutional norms, as a president has so willingly trashed that which people on both sides of our political divide have worked so hard to build up. I stood right there down near the president, raised my hand like so many of us have, like all of us have, to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. And to not see us right now, in the midst of a potential constitutional convulsion, in the midst of a potential constitutional crisis, where our president himself is not committing to the peaceful transfer of power, where there are people organizing to do harm to elected leaders, kidnap them, when you could go online right now and look at groups calling out to people with special forces training to go to polls and perhaps cause mayhem. I don't understand why we don't share a bipartisan, deep concern for what is happening right now in our country. And how this moment in American history fits into the concern that moving forward right now causes danger, causes harm. And I would be remiss to not mention that amidst it all, we are in the midst also of a racial awakening in our country. We saw what are perhaps the largest demonstrations in our nation around issues of racial justice. All 50 states towns and communities from all backgrounds, people marching and protesting around race issues. It's led to millions of Americans to learn more about our own history, discovering things like the Tulsa Massacre, discovering things like the Colfax Massacre, going to the incredible museum in Alabama for lynching, where thousands of Americans were lynched in our country, discovering our history and how it ties directly to the present. Amidst all of this, we know that issues of race and the law will continuously come up before the court until we have justice rolling down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. And in the midst of all of this, even my conversations with this nominee, I was surprised that they could not speak to one article, one law review article, one column or one book they've read about issues of race and the law. When we are still in a nation that has such bias in its outcome, where just by the color of your skin is directly correlated with longer sentences, more likely to get to the mandatory minimum, more likely to get the death penalty. Where we see no difference between blacks and whites in America for using marijuana or selling marijuana, but blacks are almost 4 times more likely to be arrested for possession of marijuana, getting criminal convictions for doing things that 2 of the last 3 presidents admitted to doing. And in the midst of all of this that has activated so many Americans and many of them to the polls today, I couldn't get even a dialogue going about issues of race. And when I specifically asked about a case, Judge Barrett's case in Smith versus Illinois Department of Transportation, this case involved a black traffic patrol driver who had been fired by the Illinois Department of Transportation. This employee claimed that he had been the subject of a hostile work environment and that his supervisor had called him the N-word. Judge Barrett ruled against him, saying that despite documenting being called the N-word by his supervisor, the employee had failed to make the case that he had been fired in retaliation for complaints about race discrimination. When I asked Judge Barrett why she ruled that a supervisor using a vile and derogatory term, one that carries with it a history of racial subjugation and violence like the N-word, did not constitute a hostile work environment. I mentioned that Judge Kavanaugh, in a similar case, ruled that it did. I was surprised after her answers to go back and read the case that she had muddied the fact in the case. In fact, she blatantly mischaracterized a key fact in the case. Judge Barrett said, and I quote, "He didn't tie the use of the N-word into the evidence that he introduced for his hostile work environment claim." When in fact, the employee's reply brief states, and I quote, "Appellant's position is that the combination of the N-word and the acts identified immediately above did create a hostile work environment." She mischaracterized her own ruling, claiming, and I quote, "So the panel very carefully wrote the opinion to make clear that it was possible for one use of the N-word to be enough to establish a hostile work environment claim if overplayed that way," when in fact, her opinion stated something different. Quote, "The N-word is an egregious racial epithet. That said, Smith can't win simply by providing that the N-word was uttered." Again, even Justice Kavanaugh stated that being called the N-word by a supervisor suffices itself to establish a racially hostile work environment. Again, in this context, at a moment that our country is moving in numbers we have not seen before, we have a justice that mischaracterizes a case, doesn't speak directly to the facts as plain as they were, and can't engage in a substantive conversation about any scholarship whatsoever around race in America. I'd like to read an excerpt of the letter from Derek Johnson, President and CEO of the NAACP. He writes, "It is disturbing enough that Judge Barrett declined to rule that use of this vile epithet constituted a racially hostile work environment, but her misrepresentation to the Judiciary Committee about the basis for her ruling raises serious questions about her truthfulness and candor under oath that extended far beyond this particular case." I would like to enter for the record a letter from the Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation signed by 18,000 Americans in opposition to the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett to serve as Associate Justice on the Supreme Court of the United States.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. And so I appeal again, one last time, to the conscience of the Senate. This is not a time to proceed. This is a time for grace. It's not a time to proceed. It's a time to firm up the foundations of our republic. It's not a time to proceed. It's a time to listen to the American people. It's a time to listen to the voters lined up now. It is a time to listen and wait. I know there's a lot of Americans who are concerned right now, not with the one nominee, but with how this process has gone. It is a process that is eroding people's trust and their faith in the institutions. They don't see fairness in this. They look at the own words of Republican senators and don't understand how hypocrisy like that can stand. One standard for one president, another standard for another. But I want to tell everyone who is hurting right now, everyone who is worried about our republic, everyone who is concerned in this moment about their health care and their voting rights and their nation, that this is not a time to give up. There will be difficult days ahead, but it's not a time to give up. We know that healthcare is at risk, but it's not a time to give up. We know that women controlling their own bodies, sacrosanct as that ideal is, and under threat as it now is, it is not a time to give up. Where LGBTQ rights are under threat, but it is not a time to give up. We cannot give up in the cause of our country. And it's not a right cause or a left cause. It is a right and wrong cause, that we can be a nation that builds for posterity a functioning republic that can elevate the best of human ideals like grace. We cannot give up in this moment. We cannot meet darkness with darkness. We cannot surrender to cynicism about our systems. We have to keep pressing forward. I still believe that our nation's history, as speckled as it is with wretchedness and pain, is still a story that is a testimony to the overcoming of injustice and the better securing of it. I still believe that we do live in a nation that the truth does prevail in the end. I still believe that even when wrongs are done, they can be righted. I still believe that though this may become today a moment of shame, that we can reclaim in this nation the ideals of our founders, those testimonies to grace, the commitment to each other of their sacred honor, that we still can take a body politic, wounded and injured, and in our country find healing, find redemption, and find grace. Mr. President, I yield the floor.